Notes Towards an African Oresteia is a 1970 film directed by, featuring, and even filmed a little bit, I think, by Pier Paolo Pasolini. I say film, but in some ways this is barely a movie. It's sometimes described as a documentary, but that's not quite right. This movie's rated 4.6 on IMDb with 368 votes, or 468 votes, I think. And honestly, I have no idea how you're supposed to pick a numerical rating for a movie like this. This is a movie that at times is sickeningly naive. At times it is hilarious, a hilarious inadvertent comedy, at least a great inadvertent satire. At times it has uncommon images. Occasionally there are subtle observations. And in some ways it does offer an incisive perspective, not on the Oresteia and not on Africa, but on European intellectualism. Without a doubt, this is an interesting movie. And in fact, I think it might be the most interesting movie I've reviewed on this channel so far. But what is it? What actually is this thing? Well, it's exactly what it says it is. Essentially, filmed production notes for a potential forthcoming film. Kind of a behind the scenes in the development process, the early production of this movie. And what movie is this? Well, it's to be an adaptation of Aeschylus's Oresteia. Pronunciations of all these things can vary. This movie was never made, thank goodness. But Pasolini released the notes. This isn't the only time he's done this. You can find his notes for a few other projects in a somewhat similar format. This movie is only 65 minutes long. I wouldn't really recommend watching it. It's a slow 65 minutes, but it is an incredibly interesting time. If you don't know, Pasolini was an extremely interesting guy. He made extreme intellectual films that were polarizing at the time and still are. He was polarizing as well and still is. He was a Marxist who did a lot of work focusing on sexual taboos. That's a recipe for controversy. And if you have never read anything about Pasolini, at the very least, go glance at his Wikipedia page. Very interesting life, even a controversial death. Without a doubt, he was an intellectual. No matter what you might think of him, he was an intellectual, or at least he thought he was. And you can see that from the very title of this movie. I mean, what kind of guy goes around making notes on the adaptation of the Oresteia? An intellectual. So why was he so interested in the Oresteia and so interested in Africa? He thought they went together. Essentially, he thought that Africa in the 1970s had some core similarities to ancient Greece, and that in Africa you could find the same early mythologies that supposedly define the human experience. I'm not jumping to any conclusions here. Pasolini spells this out. He says it very clearly in the film. He sees some deep analogies. He basically thinks that Africa is a few thousand years behind Europe, but will inevitably go through the same sorts of things. This was part of a broader school of thought known as stupidity. Really, though, Pasolini does have some sort of reverence for what he sees as essentially mythological Africans. But this is basically the definition of Eurocentrism. He's trying to copy and paste his own culture's history and traditions onto another, shoehorn another culture into his own lens, mistaking things that are provincial, local, and ultimately arbitrary for being universal. And in studying Africans as mythological subjects, even if he thinks in some ways that he's holding them up, he's at the very least patronizing them. He's degrading them, really demoting them to something much less than Europeans and maybe something much less than human. So without a doubt, a Eurocentric and a racist perspective. But let's not turn the movie off yet. Like I said, I think this movie says more about European intellectualism than it does about Africa, and it says a lot. And it's a lot more to it, honestly, than Pasolini simply being silly, because he's obviously very serious about this movie, and his ideas are developed. Even if they seem mostly completely wrong, goofy, and naive, they are developed. Like I said, he takes it seriously. I mean, he went to Africa to research, and he ends up producing, perhaps inadvertently, a really interesting movie, a really interesting document. Let me first give a brief recap of the Oresteia. Just really 3 plays. I mean, really brief, probably not very accurate. The basics are that Agamemnon, some kind of king, comes home from a war, the Trojan War. I think his wife, Clytemnestra, murders him when he gets home. I forget exactly why, but I think he sacrificed their daughter for favorable winds on his journey to Troy, something like that. The 2 kids, Orestes and Electra, as in Morning Becomes Electra, are salty about this. A bunch of stuff happens. Eventually, Orestes kills Clytemnestra, but after doing so, he is hounded by the Furies. The Furies are sort of deities of vengeance. And eventually, he's had enough. Start to get to him. He goes to Athens, big city, where Athena suggests that they set up a court system where he will be tried by fellow Athenians, and where he's acquitted. Furthermore, Athena convinces the Furies that rather than be deities of vengeance, they should become deities of justice. Eumenides is what this is called, from Furies to Eumenides. The birth of modern justice, essentially. Basically, Pasolini thinks that this is the kind of thing that's happening in Africa in 1970, that Africa is transforming from being uncivilized, from being ruled by the Furies, to just being on the precipice of modernity and of civilization, modern thought. Like I said, a pretty sketchy perspective that is not really going to have many followers these days. But what is this movie actually like? Well, it starts with some of my favorite opening credits of all time. First, Pasolini thanks African students at a university in Rome, and we'll get to their role in this movie shortly. Then the credits go on to introduce Gatto Barbieri on the saxophone. Why is there a saxophone player involved in this movie? In fact, a whole jazz band. They introduced the whole band in the credits. What does this have to do with the African Oresteia? Well, we'll get to it. Turns out Gatto Barbieri is real musicians here. Had a long career. He also played on the soundtrack for Last Tango in Paris, another controversial movie. What the heck is he doing here? Well, we'll see. These credits are just the first of many quite odd transitions and juxtapositions that travel all throughout this movie as Pasolini tries to bring his own European intellectualism together somehow with a story from ancient Greece and Africa. The first bit of this movie is really like someone's travel photos. Pasolini walking around Tanzania saying, this could be Orestes. This could be Electra. Can't you just picture this young boy as part of the chorus? He also stops by Uganda, mainly seeming like a tourist. There's some jazz music in the background. And Pasolini gives us an overview of the Oresteia at this point as well. It's nice of him. Pasolini makes a number of comments throughout here about how the Oresteia needs to be a story of real people, working people. There's a neorealist tinge to all of this, which is interesting. In some places, the things he says are very cringeworthy. Like I said, he kind of holds up the Africans as mythological beasts, something like that. Ugh, you don't like that. But at other times, he is celebrating sort of the working class nature of them. Remember, Pasolini, a Marxist. There's also an early notable comment about American influence in Africa, which Pasolini refers to as neo-capitalism. Pasolini says that throughout, no matter what happens, the movie has to be a story of the real people, of the working class. This movie isn't exactly engaging. Even though it's extremely interesting, I think the average person would be bored watching this movie. After a bunch of more ramblings, a bunch more travel images, we get a phenomenal piece of inadvertent comedy when the film cuts abruptly to Pasolini at a university in Rome, and he's in a classroom. In the seats are a bunch of African students, and Pasolini appears to have just finished showing them the film that we've just seen. Oh, no. He explains to them how he thinks that Africa and the Oresteia are linked. He says he feels he can see analogies between Africa today and the Oresteia. By the way, the end of the Trojan War, I think, was in 1180 BC, just to be clear. The transformation from the tribal to the civilized, the discovery of democracy and justice, the transformation of the Furies to the Eumenides. Having explained all of this, Pasolini says he just has two questions for the students. The first one is, should the film be set today or in the past? And by the past, Pasolini means 1960, 10 years ago. Remember, this Trojan War ended in 1180 BC, and Tanzania, by the way, is one of the oldest inhabited areas on Earth. You might think that Pasolini would open up by saying, so, is this idea I'm presenting complete nonsense? What do you think? But no, instead he asks them, do you think I should set it in the past, as in 10 years ago? What did the students say? Well, the main reaction does seem to be kind of smirking. At the same time, it's not totally clear-cut. As much as a movie like this would probably be roundly criticized in university today, the students in this film do have some interesting perspective. A big famous director comes to your school and asks for your advice on his next big movie. The first guy says, well, if you set it in 1960, prior to the independence of many of the African nations, maybe it could be valuable. People don't really seem to buy this, but that is what the first student says. The second guy says, remember, Africa isn't one place. This is a very common rejoinder. Very common for Westerners, Europeans, uneducated people, or people who are ignorant of certain things at least, to treat the entire continent as one, and usually as one big stereotype, right? And the reality is, of course, that Africa is enormous, an entire continent that is huge and that is hugely diverse. And I mean, even if you don't know much about Africa, you can sort of picture what places like Egypt, Cairo, or places like Morocco are like Western parts of Africa as well. You might know something about Senegal, for instance. Not similar. You might know something about Sierra Leone, Nigeria, Ghana. You might know something about things that are farther south, sub-Saharan Africa, right? Fairly obvious that these things are very different. And so one of the students kindly points this out to Pasolini, who doesn't really seem to be aware of it. He has gone to Tanzania and Uganda, which aren't too far apart in some ways. He also is going to use footage from Nigeria before too long. But you can tell as well that in every way, that every single time that Pasolini frames the story, the title is An African Oresteia. It never even crosses his mind, it seems, that a Tanzanian Oresteia might be different from a Nigerian one. No, instead Africa's one place. So one student calls him out on that. Like I said, most of the students are not particularly decisive or confident. There are a lot of different comments. Most people don't call him out or throw him under the bus, but it's definitely fair to say that they don't really see it. They don't really understand what he's going for. It doesn't really seem to make much sense. Pasolini engages with them. He pushes back sometimes. He discusses. He wants to have an earnest discussion with them. One of the more firm students asked Pasolini to refer to African nations rather than tribes because he says allusions to tribalism have long stoked colonial ideas. He says, well, when an Italian is on the news, he's referred to as an Italian, not by some tribe or ethnicity. Like I said, Pasolini goes back and forth. He's not dumb. He is somewhat patronizing, that is. But he wants to discuss. He wants to engage them. He does come to the school, after all. He doesn't quite seem to get the main message instantly, which is that most people seem a little bit uneasy, kind of smirking. At the very least, they don't really see it. They don't really get it. So after talking to the students for a bit, we jump back to Africa. Not with footage that Pasolini has filmed, but with archival footage from what he refers to as the Biafran Civil War, which we would now call the Nigerian Civil War, I think, which would have just ended in 1970, I think. Interesting fact about this war is that the Soviet Union and the USA were actually on the same side of this war, which is not particularly common. I think there's also some factoid about how this war was stopped for one day when Pele visited. We get a lot of pretty graphic war images in this side, in this section. Maybe the idea is to reinforce Pasolini's vision of Africa as a place of vengeance, uncivilized, ultimately. But war images are complicated. These images are affecting, but how are they affecting? I mean, different people might react different ways to seeing these powerful images. Everyone's going to react, but, maybe some people would buy into this, into Pasolini's vision, would think, there's still so long to go or something like that. Other people might be incensed that Pasolini has used these images to make his sort of, his point, right? Or to attempt to make his point. He's enlisted these images, which really say something very different. Complicated thing. I'd recommend the movie Concerning Violence, directed by Göran Olsson, a Swedish director, which is kind of built around the essay Concerning Violence from the book The Wretched of the Earth, written by Frans Fanon. This is more about colonial violence in some ways, But I think this movie concerning violence is actually an incredibly good companion piece to this movie. Definitely worth watching on its own. Jorn Olsen, very interesting. Documentarian. I don't want to get too sidetracked by the violent images part, but let's just leave it for now as kind of a puzzling development. It seems like Pasolini seems to think that it's particularly profound and important to show these images, and maybe it is, but perhaps not in the way or for the reasons that he thinks. The next part of the movie is even more puzzling. We get a free jazz performance. Here's where the jazz comes in. A jazz band with two singers, two vocalists, who are going to sing part of the Oresteia. Pasolini says, hold on a minute. I realize I might be getting somewhat sidetracked here. I might be changing the script a little bit. But I actually think it would be a good idea if rather than being recited, the Oresteia was sung. And let's have it be sung in the jazz tradition. Interesting. If you don't like free jazz, you probably won't like this part. It goes on for quite a while. And to many people might seem somewhat incoherent or noisy. Pasolini does say that there's a particular significance to using jazz, Black American music, as part of this story. But he doesn't really go very deeply into what this means exactly. Eventually, we return to Africa. They stop by the university at Dar es Salaam. He says this could be the temple of Apollo, but he also calls out progressive neo-capitalism at the university. He says that it exhibits some of the contradictions of the emerging African civilization. He takes us to the college bookshop. There's a sign above the window that said it was funded by China, and yet most of the books are Western. There's a book called The Social Education of the Adolescent, a handbook for history teachers in West Africa. A lot of these things come from England or the U.S. It's books about the school system in the U.S. He explores some of the other parts of the city as well. He says that the courts, the big fancy court building in Dar es Salaam, might be a good substitute for the court in Athens. Of course, you might think that it would be a tip-off for Pasolini going by an established court system that perhaps Africa has already progressed past the development of justice, unlike he contends by setting the Oresteia there in 1970. Clearly, courts are there already, but he doesn't really seem to catch on to this. Finally, we go back to the students, and Pasolini poses his second question. He says, this is not necessarily serious. Feel free to answer with a joke. But he asks the students, do you feel like you are Orestes? What a question, man. In some ways, maybe this is a horribly insulting question. In some ways, maybe it's an interesting question. I don't know. It's what an odd movie. The first guy says, sort of. Another says, well, hold on a minute. We aren't all the sons of tribal chiefs here. And people get a good laugh at this. Student reassures Pasolini, maybe one of us is the son of a chief or something like that, but most of us aren't. We come from cities or whatever. Another one suggests that maybe what could be useful is to show, maybe not that they're Orestes or whatever. Well, it's to use the tale to hone in on Orestes being alienated, on being a part of two worlds, right? To show how difficult it can be to reconcile Europe and Africa. Another inadvertent conclusion of this film, without a doubt, by the way. It seems like this is one thing. Like I said, in some ways, do you feel like Orestes? Like I said, in some ways, this is a horribly insulting question. But in other ways, maybe it does tap into things that the students actually feel, a sense of cultural incommensurability, a sense of alienation when they arrive in Europe and when they go back home. Alienation, by the way, that is being actively perpetuated by Pasolini here, right? This reminds me some of a book called Season of Migration to the North, written by Taib Saleh, I think is his name, which is really about cultural incommensurability, the difficulty in comparing one culture to another, specifically an African culture to a European one, the difficulty between switching context between those two. It's kind of the opposite, in some ways, of what Pasolini is trying to do here, assert that there's one universal story that's going to apply to all these different cultures, that people should all be measured by some European yardstick. Finally, Pasolini seems really intent on this question of the transition from the Furies to the Eumenides, deities of vengeance to deities of justice. Is this happening in Africa? He asked the students, how could I represent this in Africa? They have no idea, basically. Inconclusive. There's some ideas. They go back and forth. But things really seem to be breaking down. It seems like maybe even Pasolini is starting to realize this. Finally, we go back to Africa, where we get one final little puzzling take, and the movie ends. Is this movie an act of hubris or humility? Well, it might seem like surely it's hubris, intellectualism gone wrong, Pasolini thinking he's a lot smarter than he is. On the other hand, he did release the movie, as in he released the notes, and he did not make the movie. There is no African Oresteia, directed by Pier Paolo Pasolini. There are only some notes in which he does not cut out himself, to some extent floundering in front of students. His final take, like I said, that's rather weak. You can almost hear it in his voice that he feels he kind of knows it's a stretch. He kind of knows things are petering out, running out. He did go to Africa. He did talk to students. He doesn't really back down in front of them, but maybe he does listen to them, and maybe he does hear them out. Who knows? Maybe he just couldn't get the funding to make the movie, and he would have, if he could have. But like I said, a very interesting slice of European intellectualism in the 1970s, in 1970. A really interesting movie that touches on a ton of big themes. A boring movie that you might not enjoy watching that much, to be honest. But Notes Towards an African Oresteia is certainly interesting. And I think there's more to it even than what I've briefly touched on in some of these ideas, like the images of violence, cultural incommensurability. These are things that go far beyond this movie. But that this is just one interesting depiction of. So that's the Pasolini film, Notes Towards an African Oresteia. I guess I'd kind of recommend checking it out, at least if you've got an attention span.